Let's discuss AR-15 lubrication. Many of our gun lubes seem to be designed or are holdovers from a time when suppressor use was nowhere near as common, and their higher amounts of fouling, blowback, and heat may have not been anticipated. As an example, let's use mil-spec CLP, which not only lubes and protects, but also cleans, hence the acronym. It will evaporate or otherwise dry out on a rifle that simply sits in a closet for a month, and yet we're supposed to believe that it's going to be a great choice of lubricant on full auto assault rifles that are increasingly being equipped with suppressors as time goes on. CLP seems to at least do well enough to be adopted in the 80s by our military when very few suppressors were used, but it seems that we might need to take a closer look at what kind of lubricant we use if we're going to use suppressors with our rifles. Because of the adoption of CLP by our military, we of course see other people and agencies that have a choice also choose to use it or otherwise use some kind of alternative CLP that is similar. Many of these CLPs contain solvents for cleaning that seem to thin out the oil and allow it to evaporate more at the possible cost of being the best possible dedicated lubricant for a rifle. Other people swear by dedicated and or thicker lubricants, and still some even use grease. Normally, most people don't care that much, if at all, about the subject and don't see or think there's any practical benefits between different gun oils and choose to use something simple and available like motor oil. I used to feel that way too, and I used to use motor oil too. There have been some good tests done that show there are at least significant differences in corrosion protection between lubricants, and this seems to be the better known distinction between lubricants we have to purchase. I'll link a few of those tests in the description. However, what most people haven't seen is a good reliability test between these lubricants. I ended up forming my own test using a high volume of fire along with a suppressor, and in my testing overall I had very few malfunctions. And of the few malfunctions that were seen, they were on lighter weight oils. So in one sense, not caring that much about oil is somewhat correct, since most all of them did well for a near full combat load in terms of not inducing a jam when firing 150 rounds. But there's a little more to this than just malfunctions, so let's go into the details and the background of my test. I tested 11 different lubes with a good variety of types, availability, and viscosities while shooting MagTech M193 that easily met the minimum requirements to be a mil-spec ammunition of 3250 feet per second out of a 20-inch barrel. The lubricants used were ALG Go-Juice, Ballistol, Lucas Oil Extreme Duty Gun Oil, LSA, mil-spec CLP, Mobile 1 5W30, Mobile 1 Grease, Nano Gun Oil Universal, BWL, which is the current German military lubricant, Slip2000 EWL, and a homemade blend of motor oil and grease, sometimes called SOTARacha, that will be better explained later. I did not use aerosolized versions of lubricants in this test. All these oils were paid for and selected by me because I have an interest in them. Many people use them, they are easily sourced, they have a certain composition, or they have a certain viscosity. I wasn't able to test every lubricant out there, but this should be a broad enough range and varieties of lubes that we can probably have a good idea about how an untested lubricant might perform when looking at the results of this test. The rifle I used for this test was a Colt upper receiver and Colt bolt carrier group. The bolt carrier was brand new and had been fired 200 rounds through it to check for function and break-in prior to this test, and I also added a size 006 Viton O-ring for increased extractor tension. I have a 10.3 inch Daniel Defense barrel with mil-spec gas port of 70 thousandths of an inch that has about 3,000 rounds through it before this test. I used a Surefire SOCOM RC2 suppressor with the Surefire 3-prong flash hider mount. I also used a tub AR-15 flat wire spring and an H3 buffer. For the magazines, I had 4 PMags and 1 Lancer. Where a jam was observed, I noted the magazine used. My methodology involves shooting 5 fully loaded magazines of 150 rounds per lubricant, with the first 90 suppressed and the last 60 unsuppressed at a specific rate of fire shown here. I did not pause between magazine reloads. I started with a cleaned and degreased rifle before applying lubricant to be tested. I made a cleaning video that demonstrates the process used, which is worthwhile to check out if you want to see an efficient way to thoroughly clean, degrease, and lube a firearm in under 15 minutes. I did not wait for the suppressor to cool down before removing it, and I simply removed it while it was hot, which was usually between 900 and 1000 degrees Fahrenheit, and immediately began the unsuppressed portion of the test. As to why full auto was specified, this firing schedule was originally copied from a SOCOM M855A1 endurance test. This test, incidentally and unexpectedly, had malfunctions attributed to CLP being blown or burned off from this firing schedule any time after the suppressor was removed. It was so bad that the testers had to modify their methodology to include relubing the rifle any time the suppressor was removed. For their test, they were using Mark 18s and Surefire RC1 suppressors, so my rifle is largely functionally equivalent. I was hoping I could recreate these malfunctions since I could duplicate most of the conditions. I was also able to confirm that as far as lubrication blow and burn off, it made no observable difference in using an actual full auto lower or a semi-auto one that was fired in a similar cadence to the full auto one called out for. This made the test easier for me to keep doing after the confirmation, and if anyone else wants to replicate this test, it should be easier and valid as well. Just shoot as similarly as you can if you had a full auto gun in the amounts called out for. Now for the results. I'll include pictures of the bulk carrier group when reviewing the lubes individually later so that you can get an idea of how much was left after each iteration. I didn't make a video of the actual shooting of the lubes as everyone involved with this test was either busy loading magazines, shooting, cleaning the guns, picking up brass, and so on. But this should at least make the video shorter. There were very few malfunctions, and the lubes are sorted by number of malfunctions, with the most malfunctions towards the top. I was, of course, expecting more malfunction in this test, and it already took 1,650 rounds to shoot, so I wasn't able to extend the interval any more than planned. The idea was that removing a suppressor, as well as the increased force from the gas system a suppressor provides after it had left deposits and blown off lube, you would then shrink the gun's operating envelope so much that you would start to see jams occurring. Because so few jams occurred, I've also included my observations about the amount of lubrication that was remaining on the bulk carrier group, as well as descriptions of the jams that occurred. It seems that I overestimated the phenomenon in producing jams, but the lubrication blow-off and burn-off did show up when removing the bulk carrier group from the rifle after firing, and you could see a big difference between some of the lubricants. Starting with CLP. I used mil-spec non-aerosol Safariland Breakfree CLP, as it was the original brand that was adopted and it's the most commonly encountered on store shelves. It had no malfunctions. CLP is sort of the de facto standard of lubricants these days since our military uses it. It was also the lubricant that replaced LSA in the 80s. I don't know if they actually tested that it was better strictly as a lubricant than LSA, but it seems that it was adopted because it could clean and meet minimum reliability requirements the Army set, so that it was logistically the better choice and not necessarily the better lubricant. it seems unlikely there were formal tests against LSA strictly as a lubricant, as I simply cannot find anything about that. In this test, while CLP had no jams, there's beginning to be very little of it left to actually lubricate the gun. It seems to be about just as good as the BWL Waffenol, better than the plain grease, Ballistol, and Slip2000, and worse than the others. CLP was special for its time because it had cleaning agents that lubricants did not typically have back then in the 80s. Just as a side note, Cherry Bombs is a company that produces a lubricant that I did not use in this test. However, they have written really good articles on the history of firearm lubricants that is pretty thorough and goes well beyond what I will here. If you'd like to take a look, there's a link in the description. Here is an old formulation of the cleaning agents in CLP. As you can imagine, those cleaning agents necessarily are making the CLP thinner than a regular oil, and explain why CLP seems to evaporate so quickly. The CLP spec does not even have a standard for evaporation, unlike LSA and even the ancient oil it replaced, PL Special, back in the 60s, which is definitely not an oversight, and at least a tacit acknowledgement that CLP by design will evaporate or be more likely to evaporate over time than other oils. The latest revision of CLP requires at least 1/3 of the product to be bio-based as well. Since CLP is a performative specification and not a compositional one, there can be a decent amount of variance between manufacturers of CLPs and what they choose to use to meet that specification. Another CLP that seems hopefully even better than Breakfree is G96. The owner of G96 gave a pretty decent interview about his product, and I might end up doing another CLP test of it later. The most striking statement is that G96 uses no solvents. It also seems to have a much higher flash point comparable to other non-CLPs. G96 does not use Teflon, and it appears at least the latest version of Breakfree does not use Teflon either. So for all those people that are concerned about burning toxic Teflon gas or whatever it turns into, for G96 and for Breakfree, that is not the case anymore. Moving on to BWL, or Blue Weapons Lube. It had no malfunctions. It is based on the NATO S761 specifications the Germans came up with, which they seem to call it generically Waffenol, or weapons oil. If you look into the CLP spec as well as the Waffenol spec, there is a lot of overlap aside from the cleaning effect found in CLP. In fact, most of the various manufacturers producing Waffenols would qualify their oils to be within spec for CLP on the slightly thicker side, just without any of the cleaning agents. The Waffenol is only barely higher in viscosity, about 4 centistokes at various temperatures, putting it around 18 centistokes versus 14 for CLP at 104 degrees Fahrenheit. For comparison, see this table arranged by viscosity data for where it was made available to get an idea. What's strange is that since it did about the same as CLP did in this test, and since Germans were also fine with using American spec LSA in the 80s, it's strange the Germans would have bothered to go through the trouble and make a barely different lube than CLP that doesn't even clean, instead of just having common NATO stock with the US and whoever else is undoubtedly using CLP. Maybe someone knows about this and can comment. Moving on to Ballistol, like CLP, I use a liquid non-aerosol version. While using Ballistol, I had one failure to chamber on the first round of the 4th magazine while using a PMAG that was not able to be remedied by a decent amount of force applied to the forward assist twice. I was then unable to pull the charging handle back and it felt stuck in place. I then mortared the rifle on the ground, the round extracted, ejected, and the next round fed and chambered fine with no further issues. Ballistol is probably the oldest type of oil on this list. Ballistol has a great history page about their product going all the way back to 1904 for the German Army. If I have the history right, LSA replaced Ballistol and Waffenol replaced LSA. Ballistol is a CLP with a viscosity just under 20 centistokes at 104 degrees Fahrenheit. It has a strong and distinct smell. It also lists a specification for evaporation loss, which is much worse than a non-CLP oil, and we can probably take a guess that it is similar to US mil-spec CLP in that regard. As you can see, the thinner lubricants in CLPs especially will evaporate more than thicker lubes like LSA will. Ballistol also provided a chart to show its particular viscosity and temperature relationship. Ballistol's pour point is also 1.4 degrees Fahrenheit, which means it will not flow out of a container on its own at this temperature or below, so this lube is ill-suited for sub-freezing conditions in a way that US CLP or even thicker oils do much better at. I'd imagine if the German Army was using this formulation back in the day, they would have had to cut it with kerosene or some other kind of fuel to make it not as thick in the winter. ALG Go-Juice is a bio-based lubricant that has a viscosity of about 28 centistokes at 104 degrees Fahrenheit. It gave me 0 malfunctions. It was also the oil I had been using before I conducted this test, and in my experience, I found it to do a reasonably good job on this same suppressed rifle with just simple reapplication and no cleaning. It used to be purple, seemingly from a coloring additive, but now it seems they do not add that coloring additive anymore, and it has more of an amber hue to it. Slip2000 Extreme Weapons Lube gave me 2 jams. Both were on a failure to feed from the first round after the bolt release was pressed on the second magazine, which was a Lancer, and the fourth magazine, which was a PMag. Both were easily remediated with a light application of force on the forward assist. It is the lube I remember in advertisements and on gun forums some years ago. BCM used to include pamphlets with some of the orders they shipped and had one SWAT magazine article about a specific rifle they called the Filthy 14 and how well it ran with Slip2000 EWL. The purpose of the Filthy 14 was some kind of endurance test, and they're showing that as long as you reapplied lubrication and used a good lubricant on the AR-15, that it could keep on running just fine. And BCM happened to use Slip2000 EWL for that. I'll go ahead and link that SWAT magazine article. It's free, so you can check it out if you want. It is similar in viscosity to CLP, but it is supposed to be a dedicated lubricant rather than a compromised cleaner and lube. There are also thicker versions of it, similar to 30-weight oil, like a 30-weight motor oil, as well as a grease. I'm a little disappointed in it, and I wanted it to do well since it has always had a cool GWAT vibe for me, and it seems like it was, at least in my eyes, the original challenger to CLP's throne. Unfortunately, I lost the picture of the bolt carrier group after the test, but I wrote down that it was about as dry as CLP, so... And that makes sense, considering that this is the one that jammed twice on us. LSA is one of the older lubricants used in this test that was replaced by CLP in the 80s. Its acronym stands for Lubricant Semi-Fluid Automatic Weapons. It is unique in that it was originally formulated by the US government. Because of this, it is not simply a performance specification where whatever lube formula that meets the spec is allowed, but it is also a compositional specification that requires a specific blend of materials in addition to needing to meet a performance spec. And because the specification is a public document, in one way it's almost like an open source gun oil, since you have the exact formulation, and if there's any updates to it, the government has to approve it, and you'll see it in the documentation for that. LSA is a synthetic ester oil that is blended with 8% lithium stearate, which is the base for lithium grease and gives it the creamy white color that it has. And 3% of extra additives for things like anti-acid and anti-corrosion, which makes this pretty advanced for the time it came out and using the synthetic ester. And that also makes it still great by today's standards in terms of a base oil, at least as far as I can tell. It was originally made for the M60 Vulcan Gatling gun on fighter jets because regular gun oil would just fling off during testing from the centrifugal force of the gun spinning around so fast. And the lithium grease, that is it's called the thickener. It obviously made the oil thicker and it helped it stay put. Back then, they seemed to spare no expense to keep a high value item like the M60 Vulcan Gatling gun running. And in contrast, the government seems to be willing to compromise a lot more for handheld small arms. And so it seems that the sort of attitude that made LSA work well on the M60 Vulcan translated well for our rifles that ended up using LSA. LSA ended up being used for the M16 and our other small arms during the middle of Vietnam, as the regular gun oil used in World War II and before, PL Special, was a pretty lousy oil, and LSA's validation as a lubricant was actually pretty well documented in the ICARD hearings on the M16's reliability problems in Vietnam. And LSA was part of the solution that ended up making the M16 more reliable than it had ever been before in its original design. LSA's base oil is around 12 centistokes, so some of that base oil can keep around and penetrate in the manner of a thinner oil CLP, while the lithium helps keep a lot of that base oil sticking to the rifle and from being slung off, as was seen in the suppressor test. LSA was even bizarrely reauthorized in 2011 by the Army, and it currently has an active stock number. I have no idea why the Army did that, and if any of you know, I'd like to hear about it. But there are also surplus quart cans of it available for around $20, while a new production quart can would cost around $100. And that sounds like a lot, but that's kind of about what you're paying for CLP if you're to buy a quart. Like CLP, it must be shaken before application because its components will separate some when left sitting. Motor oil has always been a staple gun lube for people who aren't convinced of the specialty gun lubes or people that just didn't happen to have a gun lube on hand. I used Mobil 1 5W30 synthetic in this test without issue. Mobil 1 5W30 has a very thick initial 104 degree Fahrenheit viscosity of 63 centistokes, and that drops off to about 10 centistokes at 212 degrees Fahrenheit, which is roughly close enough to where the temperature of an engine is. So if you look at 0W20 or 0W16 oil, they are both pretty close to this 10 centistokes at that same rough operating temperature. So 0W20 starts off at 45 centistokes, and 0W16 starts off at 32 centistokes, both at the lower 104 degrees Fahrenheit. And then they both end up at 9 and 7 centistokes, respectively, at 212 degrees Fahrenheit. So there's kind of more of a targeted centistoke viscosity for the operating temperature that engines are at, and the different grades will end up giving you thicker oils at ambient. So and that's they achieving that from all these viscosity modifiers and additives that are obviously made for these engines and not for these guns. So and you know, it's kind of suggesting to me that they're not made to run in ambient temperatures. I don't know if that changes anything for these additives and how they work at ambient temperatures. It's just, that's something I would be a little suspect about. While it seems that motor oils are designed to keep a more steady viscosity around 10 centistokes at 212 Fahrenheit, and if you look at our CLPs, the LSA base oil, and even the old PL Special, they're only barely above 10 centistokes at just 104 degrees Fahrenheit. So to me it seems that motor oils and gun oils have a mismatch for intended operating temperatures. Our next oil, at least, is from a company with a background and tradition of making racing oils, so we will in a sense get to see what the people who design motor oils would do when designing a gun oil. Lucas Extreme Duty Gun Oil is a heavy viscosity oil that is, quote, designed for firearms that experience high volume, full auto, and suppressed fire, unquote. It has a viscosity listed only at 212 degrees Fahrenheit of 15 centistokes, which is 50% thicker than 5W30 at that same temperature. And that is without the oil being unnecessarily thick at ambient. Lucas Oil is a company that makes race engine oil, so this is the exact kind of product a motor oil company would make for this sort of test, at least, and it lends credence to motor oil being mediocre or less than optimal for guns. So I had no malfunction with this lubricant and had better results than plain 5W30, so this all makes sense to me. It ended up doing about the same as ALG Go-Juice, and it was only beaten by the mixed oils like LSA, the Nano Gun Oil, and SOTARacha. Grease has seemed to fall by the wayside these days as a gun lubricant. While it worked here without issue in my rifle, it was incredibly sluggish by the end of the test. I'm actually surprised that it was still able to go into battery, considering that there is a significant audible delay between the release of the bolt catch and when it would go into battery. So even though there are no jams, the grease did not give me a lot of confidence in it as a lubricant, and it's actually the one I would choose last in this whole list. I would actually rather use the Slip2000, you know, the one that jammed twice, or Ballistol rather than pure grease, just only because the grease can't really be trusted to work in cold weather, and I guess Ballistol probably can't either. So I would put them about in the same position, and I'd rather use Slip2000 since that one actually meets CLP specs for cold weather. So, but for what it's worth, the grease did stay put reasonably well. Perhaps a thinner grease would end up doing better here. So this was an NGLI number 2. It's the standard automotive grease. It's fairly thick, and maybe a grade 1 or a grade 0 more specialty grease would end up doing better here. Up next is what is sometimes called SOTARacha, which is named after the homemade lube mix that School of the American Rifleman is known for using. It is a blend of motor oil and grease, where SOTAR happens to use the same Mobil 1 5W30 oil and Mobil 1 grease I used here. So I'll include a link to the video where he goes over this, but just to make it short and sweet for you guys, the mixture is a rough estimation of the consistency of honey. And here's a video of the lube I mixed up for this test, so you could get an idea of the consistency that I used. Alright, here's the SOTARacha. And that's the consistency that we got it to. Mobil 1 5W30 synthetic and Mobil 1 synthetic NGLI 2 grease mixed to the consistency of honey. So when you take two things where the motor oil gives you an alright result and the grease gives you a very questionable one, and you combine those two together, you'd think it would be not all that great or pretty lousy. But as it turns out, I guess there's some kind of synergistic effect or something that allows them to work better than they can do on their own. So, or at least here in the AR-15. In some ways, this lube is reminiscent of LSA in that it is an oil and grease mixed together to make a thicker lubricant that has better staying power and still has a little bit of creeping power in it too from the base oil with the grease. So, and it performed about as well as LSA did in this test. As far as mixing, Mobil 1 oil and grease were very easy for me to mix inside of a mason jar just by shaking it, and they stayed that way. It didn't come out of suspension or anything like that. So some other grease and oils don't seem to mix as easily, and they get chunkier or fall out of mixture. So I just be careful with this one, and if you want to test alternate greases and motor oils, I would mix it up and test it out before you start using it. But this Mobil 1 oil and grease seems to do the job pretty well. Nano Gun Oil Universal is a very interesting lubricant. It is made in batches by a passionate German gun enthusiast that frequents 4chan, and he is basically getting this made on his own. It's a pretty simple lube here. It's made of a good PAO, or polyalpha. Let me try and say this. Polyalpha olefin and ester blended oil with nano-sized particles, which gives it a thick white color to the oil. Kind of a funny theme going on here. And if you don't know what all that other technical jargon means that I was talking about before, all it means is that this is a good synthetic oil-based stock that he didn't cheap out on. The nanoparticles are supposed to be a friction-reducing material. It's supposed to go in and fill in the gaps and all little pores and impurities on the metal surfaces on your gun. You can actually see the oil, the nanoparticles, they separate, and the nanoparticles go out of suspension if you just let the bottle sit around. So, and like LSA or CLP, you're supposed to shake it before using it to get the full potential out of this oil, and it says to do that on the bottle. So it's a lot like LSA in some ways. But just it doesn't use a grease. It uses these high-tech nanoparticles. So this is the more modern stuff. So this one ended up being just a little bit ahead of the LSA and SOTARacha, just in terms of the smoothness of cycling and the amount left over. So I'd say this one was the best overall. So with all the lubes out of the way, let's just kind of do a little recap and see what we had here. Thematically, the mixed lubricants like LSA, SOTARacha, and the Nano Gun Oil Universal, they seem to do the best. And I put all of these on a chart with my own subjective ranking. And I've included a lot of extra information here for any of you that are interested in that. The higher viscosity lubricants like Go-Juice and Lucas were the runners-up. And so they were the leaders of what you would call like just regular plain oil and, unmixed with other particles or greases or whatever. So they weren't far behind the SOTARacha and LSA, and they seemed to me to be slightly ahead of the plain motor oil like 5W30. The CLPs and the light oils that were below 20 centistokes at 104 degrees Fahrenheit, they seem to do the worst. So I'd say that those oils, they might be good on a unsuppressed rifle. They might be doing a lot better or equivalent to Lucas, but in this test with the high rate of fire, high volume of fire, and a suppressor, they don't seem to be in the same league, and I think there is a significant difference there. I'm pretty convinced by the results of this test that there is a significant difference here. You do want at least a thicker oil, or ideally one of these mixed oils, if you're going to try and have a good maintenance regime for your rifle. Also, as another note of interest, the SOCOM testing team also experienced their magazines beginning to jam after 600 rounds were shot suppressed for a given magazine, and this was both for PMags and for the USGI magazines. If you ever wanted an idea of how often magazines should be cleaned, that should at least give 1 point of data for an answer to that question. Incidentally, the jams I encountered in this test validate to an extent what I had said in my previous video about how if we have better magazines than before, that we should expect to see less jams that are reliably cleared with a typical immediate action drill, and those only fix issues that are more common to bad magazines, and we should see more jams that are able to be reliably cleared from a use of the forward assist. In this video, we had 2 jams that were easily cleared by the forward assist that were at a point in the feeding cycle where a double feed would have occurred if I used a more typical immediate action drill. For the third jam, even with a decent amount of force applied to the forward assist, it did not lock up any more than the AR-15 can normally do under its own mechanical power in normal operation. And since it was easily cleared with a mooring of the rifle in a second or two, it could have even required a mooring before I ever touched the forward assist. So it's not a good position to say that the forward assist was 100% the cause of this. You and I, we can't go back in time and tell. But this could have been caused by like the Ballistol gumming up, or the round could have been slightly out of spec. But even if you count this as against the forward assist, and this test using the forward assist first was overall better than not using it first. So this goes against what some of the critics say, that you shouldn't use it first, or that it can make the jam significantly worse, because this was the standard failure to extract a round, and mortaring a rifle is something that happens normally without an initial use of the forward assist. So it didn't jam up the rifle any worse than the AR-15 can on its own, just from the action spring. So with all that out of the way, feel free to replicate the test on your own rifles and the lubes you are interested in. I'd say to use liquid Breakfree CLP as a control, since it'd probably be pretty easy for you to find. As far as what could be changed, I could have let the guns cool down and maybe the oil could have sludged up a little bit and after the suppressed portion, and that may have increased the jams. But I think the reason why we didn't see the jams like in the SOCOM test was that the M855A1 tips were having a little more drag than M193 on the older feed angle magazines, but that's just me taking a guess and all the forcing cone damage that happened. So I hope this was informative and helpful for any of you interested in gun lubrication. Thanks for watching.